The first true cold of November 1877 settled on the Dakota Prairie, not like a blanket, but like a judgment. On the morning of the 12th, the mercury in the thermometer outside the Redemption General Store was a thin, unforgiving line of silver marking 22 degrees below zero. The wind, a ceaseless and invisible river flowing out of the northwest, gusted to 40 miles per hour, driving granules of old snow horizontally across the frozen earth. It was a wind that scoured the land of all warmth, all life, all hope. It was a wind that made a man question God's plan for this empty quarter of the world. And it was on this morning that Elias Thorne, the settlement's most respected builder, saw Katerina Vogel digging in the dirt. She was a widow, newly arrived that summer from the east, though her accent spoke of a place much farther away, a place of flat plains and hard winters somewhere in the vastness of the Russian Empire. She had come with a quiet, solemn 7-year-old son named Karl, and a pittance of money that had been just enough to file a claim on the 160 acres everyone else had passed over. The plot was considered cursed, dominated by a shallow, ugly draw and the collapsed remains of a dug-out soddy abandoned by a homesteader who had lost his mind or his will 2 winters prior. It was in the wreckage of this failure that Katerina now worked, not clearing it, but digging deeper into its frozen heart with a pickaxe and a shovel. Inside the relative warmth of the general store, Elias Thorne shook his head, the motion slow and grave. He was a man who had built a dozen cabins in Redemption, each one a testament to the sound, sensible principles of American construction. He used lodgepole pine, cut and notched with precision. He built tall, proud stone chimneys that drew like a furnace and stood as monuments to a family's permanence. He saw what Katerina Vogel was doing, not merely as foolish, but as a kind of sin against common sense. "She's digging her own grave," he said to Sergeant Miller, who was weighing a sack of flour. "And the boys, too." Sergeant Miller, a man whose chin was permanently blue from a lifetime of close shaves and whose posture was as unyielding as an iron fence post, nodded in grim agreement. His concern was not for the principles of construction, but for the practical matter of survival. He was the unofficial authority in Redemption, the man people turned to when a horse was stolen or a dispute needed settling. "It's a danger," Miller stated, his voice flat. "No proper walls, no foundation. She'll try to roof that hole with sod, and the first heavy snow will crush them in their sleep. It's a tragedy waiting for a date." The other men in the store, farmers and trappers smelling of wood smoke and chewing tobacco, murmured their assent. They had all seen her, a lone woman in a drab woolen shawl, swinging a pickaxe into the iron-hard ground, her movements methodical and tireless, seemingly oblivious to the mockery that followed her like a shadow. Katerina was not oblivious. She was merely indifferent. The opinions of these loud American men were like the wind, a constant pressure to be endured, but not a force that could alter her course. Her knowledge did not come from a book or a blueprint. It came from her grandfather, a stern man with hands like gnarled oak roots, who had been one of the original German colonists invited by Catherine the Great to settle the barren steppes along the Volga River. He had taught her not how to build a house, but how to build a home that was a partner with the earth, not a fragile fortress against it. He had taught her about the Pechka, the great masonry heart of a Russian home, but more than that, he had taught her the secret that made it work: the cockaloom. The word was a family corruption, a name her grandfather had used for the intricate labyrinth of stone-lined channels that lay beneath the floor. It was a technology ancient and profound, a domestic hypocaust system born of brutal necessity. The Americans, for all their ingenuity, were obsessed with fire. They built magnificent fireplaces, monuments to consumption. They loved the sight of a roaring blaze. Her people were not concerned with fire. They were concerned with heat. They understood that a leaping flame was a spectacle of waste, with 90% of its warmth rushing up a straight chimney to be lost to the indifferent sky. The cockaloom was designed to capture that fleeing heat, to force it to surrender its energy not to the air, but to the earth. Her project began not with walls, but with a trench. From the base of where her hearth would be, she excavated a central channel, 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep, running the entire 20-foot length of the main room. From this central artery, she dug a series of smaller, perpendicular channels, each about a foot wide, creating a grid-like pattern that covered the entire floor space. For weeks, she and Carl had hauled river stones, smooth and dense, from the creek bed a half-mile away. They used a small hand cart, their progress slow and arduous. She lined the bottom and sides of every channel with these stones, mortaring them with a thick, sticky clay she dug from the creek bank, mixed with prairie grass for binding. It was back-breaking, mind-numbing work. The American way was to build fast and fight the cold later with a mountain of firewood. Their cabins were boxes of thin, single-layer logs, chinked with mud that cracked and fell out. Their chimneys were simple, inefficient columns of stone that became conduits for icy drafts the moment the fire died down. Katerina's method was the opposite. She was building slow, investing all her labor into a system of thermal mass. The smoke and hot gases from her small, efficient fire would not be allowed to escape. They would be drawn down into the cockaloom, forced to snake through the 150-foot maze of stone channels under her floor. By the time the smoke finally exited the modest low chimney stack at the far end of the cabin, it would be cool to the touch, having surrendered all its thermal energy to the immense stone and earth battery beneath her feet. In late November, Elias Thorne decided his conscience could bear it no longer. He marched to her claim, his boots crunching on the frost-heaved ground, a sense of righteous purpose in his stride. He found her on her knees, carefully fitting a flat capstone over one of the channels. Carl was mixing a fresh batch of clay mud, his small hands chapped and red. Elias cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he began, his tone that of a man delivering a difficult but necessary truth. "Mrs. Vogel, I have built more homes than any man in this territory. I know wood and I know stone, and I am telling you this will not work." Katerina looked up, her face impassive, her gray eyes revealing nothing. She did not stop her work. She simply waited for him to continue. "Heat rises," Elias declared, pointing a finger upward as if explaining gravity to a child. "It is a law of God and nature. You are trying to make your smoke go down and sideways. It will not go. The moment you light a fire in this contraption, this entire hole will fill with smoke. You will suffocate. You will kill yourself and that boy." He paused, letting the weight of his expertise settle. "You must build a proper chimney, a straight flue. It is the only safe way." Katerina carefully placed the capstone, tapping it level with the handle of her trowel. She wiped her clay-caked hands on her apron and finally rose to her feet. She was not a tall woman, but her stillness gave her a peculiar authority. She looked at Elias Thorne, not with anger or defiance, but with a kind of weary patience. "You are wrong," she said, her English clipped and precise. "Heat does not rise. Hot air rises. Heat," she said, patting the cold stone at her feet, "radiates. It goes into the stone. The smoke does not choose. It goes where the draught pulls it. She pointed to the low opening of the chimney on the far wall. The pull is there, so the smoke will go there. The stone holds the heat. Your American chimney gives all its heat to the sky. My floor will give its heat to my sun. She then knelt and returned to her work. The conversation was over. Elias Thorne stood there for a long moment, speechless. He was a good man, and his warning had been sincere. To have it dismissed so completely, with such unshakable, quiet certainty, was more than just frustrating. It was insulting. He turned and stormed away, his boots kicking up clods of frozen dirt. He had tried. He had done his Christian duty. When the inevitable happened, his conscience would be clear. He was wrong about the chimney. He was wrong about Katerina. And the prairie was preparing a lesson in physics that no one in redemption would ever forget. December arrived with a series of smaller storms, dustings of snow that sharpened the edges of the landscape and deepened the cold. Katerina finished the cockaloom and covered it with a thick layer of clay and packed earth, creating her floor. She built her pechka against the back wall, a squat, massive structure of stone and clay with a small firebox and a heavy iron door she had salvaged. Her walls were not logs, but the earth itself, the dugout portion of the cabin. The upper part, rising only 4 feet above ground level, was built of thick sod bricks, 2 feet deep. Her roof was not sod, but a careful lattice of scavenged timbers covered in packed clay, moss, and finally a layer of the sod she had removed. Her one window was small and faced south. Her door was thick and insulated with rabbit fur. The entire structure hunkered low to the ground, presenting the smallest possible profile to the relentless northwest wind. From a distance, it looked less like a home and more like a natural feature of the earth, a burrow. The total cost of materials she had to purchase, the window pane, the door hinges, a few tools, and some sacks of lime, came to $22. The men in town laughed. Thorne's cabin was a proud 2-story structure of squared logs that had cost him nearly $300. Miller's was smaller, but built to military precision. They saw her hovel as a sign of poverty and desperation. They could not comprehend that every element of its design was a product of generations of accumulated wisdom. They saw a hole in the ground. She had built a thermal capacitor. The first week of January 1878 was unnervingly mild, a chinook that brought a false spring. The temperature climbed above freezing, and the snow melted into a muddy slush. But Katerina felt no relief. She watched the sky. She watched the behavior of the prairie dogs, who sealed their burrows tight. She noted the strange, high-altitude clouds that streamed in from the northwest, thin and feathery like skeletal fingers. An old Lakota man with whom she sometimes traded furs for flour stopped by her claim. He did not speak, but he looked at the sky, then at her low-roofed home, and gave a single, slow nod before moving on. The signs were all there. Her grandfather had taught her to read them. A great storm was coming. Not a storm of snow, but a storm of cold. A storm that carried what her people called the killing sense. On the afternoon of January 9th, she made her final preparations. She and Carl brought in the last of the lignite coal and buffalo chips, stacking them high inside. She checked the seal on her door again, packing the edges with more fur. She cooked a large, hearty stew, filling the small cabin with the smell of rabbit and root vegetables. The fire in the pechka was small, just a handful of coal, but the floor was already radiating a deep, penetrating warmth. The air inside was still and quiet. Outside, the world was holding its breath. The temperature was 10 degrees above zero. The barometer in the general store had begun to plummet. The storm did not arrive, it materialized. At 4 in the afternoon, the sky went from a pale, hazy gray to a bruised, violent purple in the space of 15 minutes. The wind, which had been a quiet breeze, suddenly rose to a piercing shriek. The temperature dropped as if it had fallen off a cliff. By 6 o'clock, it was 10 below zero. By 9, it was 30 below. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not gently, but driven with the force of sand-blasting grit. The blizzard had come. It was a physical entity, a white monster that devoured the landscape, erasing the horizon, the sky, and all sense of direction. The world was reduced to a screaming, milky chaos. Inside Elias Thorne's handsome log cabin, the fight for survival had begun. The wind hammered the north wall, a relentless cannonade that forced icy air through every tiny chink in the logs. The great stone chimney, his pride and joy, had become his greatest enemy. The massive fire he had built to combat the cold created a powerful updraft, sucking the warm air out of the room and pulling in freezing drafts from under the doors and around the window frames. The floor was a sheet of ice. The family, Elias, his wife Sarah, and their 3 children, were huddled on the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Just 5 feet from the roaring flames, the air was cold enough to see their breath. The pile of firewood that should have lasted a week was already half gone. Fear, cold and sharp, was beginning to settle in Elias's gut. 2 miles away, in Sergeant Miller's meticulously built home, the situation was the same. Miller was a man of discipline and planning. He had a full cord of wood stacked and ready. But he watched in disbelief as the stove consumed it. The cast-iron box stove glowed red-hot, but its heat was convective. It warmed the air, which was immediately pulled toward the ceiling and sucked out the stovepipe. The walls of the cabin were weeping frost on the inside. His wife was trying to keep their infant son warm, but the child's skin was cold to the touch. The storm was not just outside. It had invaded their home. It was winning. And in Katerina Vogel's burrow there was peace. The roar of the wind was a distant, muted hum, the sound of a faraway sea. The earth and sod walls, 2 feet thick, were impervious to the gale. The temperature inside was a steady 71 degrees. The Petchka was barely lit. A few chunks of lignite smoldered on the grate. The firebox door shut tight. The heat was not in the air. It was in the floor. A vast, gentle warmth radiated up from the stone and earth, warming their feet, their bodies, the very air they breathed. Carl was asleep in his small bed, snug under a single quilt, his cheeks flushed with warmth. Katerina sat at her small table, mending a tear in his trousers by the light of a tallow lamp. There was no draught, there was no fear. There was only a profound, unshakable warmth. The storm could rage for a week, and it would not matter. Her home was a part of the earth, and the earth held its heat. By the morning of the second day, the temperature outside had dropped to 42 degrees below zero. The wind was a constant, screaming force of over 50 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that was beyond calculation, beyond human comprehension. It was a cold that could freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. It was a cold that killed. At the Thorne cabin, desperation had set in. Their youngest daughter, 5-year-old Lily, had developed a harsh, barking cough overnight. Her breathing was shallow, and her lips had a bluish tinge. Sarah Thorne, holding the feverish child, looked at her husband with terrified eyes. "Elias, she's burning up, but she's so cold. The cold is in her lungs." Elias knew she was right. The croup was a familiar winter danger, but this was different. The relentless chill in the cabin was preventing her from fighting the sickness. He looked at the dwindling woodpile, at the frost climbing the walls, at his sick child, and he felt the crushing weight of his own failure. All his experience, all his pride in his work, it was all worthless against this white demon. He had built a beautiful box, a proud American house, but it was a cold, drafty tomb. And then a thought surfaced, a memory of a quiet woman with gray eyes, a woman who had talked about stone and heat, a woman he had mocked. It was an impossible, humiliating idea, but it was the only one he had left. "We have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. Sarah stared at him. "Go where? We'll die out there in a minute." "To the widow's place," Elias said, the words tasting like ash. "Her place. It might... I don't know. It can't be worse than this." It was a desperate gamble, a mad dash through a storm that could kill them in 100 yards. But looking at Lily's labored breathing, he knew staying was the greater risk. They wrapped the child in a cocoon of blankets until only her small face was visible. Elias pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and tied a rope from the cabin's door latch to his waist. He would play it out as he walked, his only hope of finding his way back if he couldn't find her dugout. He took his daughter from Sarah's arms. "Pray," he said, and plunged into the white hell. The world outside was not a world at all. It was a sensory deprivation chamber of screaming wind and blinding, stinging snow. He could not see his own feet. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his lungs. He shuffled forward, leaning into the wind, his only guide the slight incline of the draw he knew led to her claim. Every step was an act of faith. He thought he was lost a dozen times, the disorientation complete and terrifying. But then his boot hit something solid. He stumbled and fell, his hands finding the low edge of a sod wall. He had found it. He crawled on his hands and knees until he found the door, a small, dark rectangle barely visible against the drift. He pounded on it with his frozen fist, his calls swallowed by the storm. The door opened. A wave of heat, thick and palpable as a wall of wool, rolled out and enveloped him. It was the most shocking sensation of his life. For a moment he was too stunned to move. Behind the door stood Katerina Vogel, holding a lamp. She looked at him, at the bundled child in his arms, and her expression did not change. There was no surprise, no triumph. She simply stepped back and held the door open wider. "Come in," she said. Elias stumbled inside, into a world of impossible warmth. The air was still and calm. The light from the lamp was soft. He could hear the storm outside, but it sounded a world away. He unwrapped Lily, and the child took a deep, shuddering breath of the warm air. Katerina took the girl from him, her movements efficient and calm. She laid Lily on her own bed, felt her forehead, and listened to her chest. She then went to the pechka, where a kettle was steaming gently on the warm stone top. She prepared a mug of warm water with honey and a bit of herbal tincture. She propped Lily up and helped the child drink. The warmth of the room, the steam from the kettle, and the warm drink began to work immediately. Lily's breathing eased, the terrible rasping sound softening. Elias stood in the middle of the room, dumbfounded. He touched the floor with his hand. It was warm. Not hot, but deeply, thoroughly warm, like a sun-baked stone in August. He looked at the tiny fire in the hearth, a fire no bigger than his fist, and then at the vast, even warmth of the room. It defied every principle he knew. It was magic. For 2 days the storm raged on. Elias made the perilous journey back to his own cabin to get Sarah and the other children. They huddled together in Katerina's small, warm space, a refugee camp of the humbled and the saved. Katerina shared her food, her space, and her quiet competence without a word of reproach. She moved with a serene purpose, tending to Lily, stoking the tiny fire once every 12 hours, her presence a silent testament to a wisdom they had so arrogantly dismissed. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd day, the world it revealed was alien and transformed, buried under massive drifts, scoured clean by the wind. The temperature was still 20 below, but the silence was deafening. The first visitor was Sergeant Miller. He had survived, but his cabin was a wreck, his fuel gone, his family huddled and sick. He had seen the smoke from Katerina's low chimney throughout the storm, not a plume, but a lazy, almost invisible wisp, and had come to see how she had fared. When he stepped inside and felt the warmth, the same look of stunned disbelief crossed his face as it had Elias's. He saw the Thorne family, safe and sound. He saw Lily, awake and breathing easily. He took off his hat. His military bearing dissolved into simple, profound humility. Elias Thorne was the one who finally spoke the words. He stood before Katerina, a man broken down and rebuilt. "I was wrong, Mrs. Vogel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I came to warn you. I called you a fool, but my house is a barn of ice, and my daughter nearly died in it. Your home, this home, it saved her. It saved all of us. I don't understand it. Please, show me." And so Katerina showed them. She did not lecture, she demonstrated. She explained the principle of the draft, how the taller, colder column of air in the chimney stack created a constant pull, drawing the smoke through the long, warm channels of the cockaloom. She showed them the clean-out ports she had built to remove the creosote every few years. She had them feel the floor, the walls, the massive stone mass of the Pechka, all of which were slowly and constantly releasing the heat they had stored. She explained that she wasn't heating the air in the room, she was heating the room itself. The room was the stove. That spring, the settlement of Redemption was transformed. The sound of pickaxes and shovels echoed across the prairie. Led by a humbled and zealous Elias Thorne, the men came to Katerina, not with advice, but with requests for instruction. She would walk from claim to claim, her son Carl trailing behind her, and she would show them where to dig, how to lay the stones, how to mix the clay. Thorne, the proud builder, became her most devoted apprentice. He abandoned his tall, foolish chimneys and learned the subtle art of the cockaloom. Sergeant Miller, a man of logistics, organized teams to haul river stone. The community, forged in the crucible of that terrible blizzard, was reborn around a new, shared knowledge. The homes they built that summer were different. They hunkered lower to the earth. Their walls were thicker, their windows smaller. And at the heart of each one was a Vogel stove, as they came to be called. The next winter was just as cold, but it was not as deadly. Families were warm. Fuel consumption dropped by 80%. The children were healthy. Katerina Vogel, the strange, foreign widow, had become the quiet, revered matriarch of the community. Her wisdom, carried across an ocean from the windswept steppes of Russia, had taken root in the Dakota soil. Decades passed. Katerina lived to be a very old woman, watching her son Carl grow and have children of his own. The Dakota hypocaust became a known regional oddity, a footnote in agricultural journals, and a subject of study for a young professor at the State University in the 1920s, who documented the unusual fuel efficiency of homes in Redemption County. The knowledge was passed down, a legacy of stone and clay. But the world was changing. The railroad snaked its way across the plains, bringing cheap, abundant coal from the mines of Pennsylvania and Illinois. New, efficient cast-iron stoves from mail-order catalogs arrived, promising modern convenience without the back-breaking labor of digging trenches and hauling stone. Slowly, the old ways were forgotten. Why spend a summer building a Petchka when a new Monarch stove could be delivered for $30? The younger generation saw the earthen homes of their parents as relics of a poorer, harder time. They built tall, clapboard houses with big windows, heated by coal furnaces. The knowledge of the cockaloom faded from living memory, becoming a ghost story told by old-timers, a curious tale of how the first settlers survived. The intricate stone channels lay dormant and buried beneath the floors of abandoned soddies, their purpose forgotten. In 2012, a young couple bought a piece of land outside the now dwindling town of Redemption. They planned to build a new home. While excavating for their foundation, the backhoe struck something hard. It was a network of carefully laid stone channels, forming a strange grid just beneath the topsoil. They thought it was an old drainage system, or perhaps the foundation of a strange barn. A local historian was called in, an elderly man who remembered the stories his grandmother had told him. He recognized it immediately. It was the foundation of the old Vogel place. It was the remnant of a cockaloom. The story of Katharina Vogel is not just the story of a clever design. It is a story about the quiet, unyielding power of ancestral knowledge in the face of arrogant convention. It is a testament to the immigrant experience, to the wisdom carried in the hearts and hands of those who come to a new land, wisdom that is too often dismissed by those who are already there. It is a reminder that the most profound solutions are often the simplest, grounded in the timeless laws of the earth itself. The people are gone. The memory has faded. The proud log cabins have long since rotted into the soil. But the stones are still there. Buried in the Dakota prairie, the stones still remember the heat.